The White House has authorized the Pentagon to use lethal force against drug cartels. But is this really going to have the impact the administration hopes? And is there some other more uncomfortable links between the cartels and the administration's priorities? Let's get into it. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Hit that subscribe button. Help me out. Always helps me to tell YouTube that, yes, people do like my content. So this is from New York Post. So again, a right of center site for sure, but they are going to definitely repeat the administration's sort of stance on things. And what they have reported is that the Trump administration secretly authorized the military force against Latin American drug cartels by reclassifying them as foreign terrorist organizations. Now, those of you that don't know, that is the plot, actually, of Clear and Present Danger, the president secretly authorizing the military to go after drug cartels. The entire plot of that is that it's a bad idea, and you know it's bad when even Tom Clancy thought it was not a great call. But this, maybe it'll have a different outcome this time. And the New York Times says that U.S. forces were given official permission to engage cartels on land and sea, and with the explicit goal that the president is determined to not just dismantle, but completely destroy Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro's Cartel de los Soles and obliterate their operations in the Western Hemisphere. State Department's list of foreign terror organizations involved in drug trafficking include Venezuela's Tren de Aragua, Cartel de los Soles, as well as El Salvador's based MS-13. Now, it's worth noting that there's a bunch of other cartels. So there's huge links between the cartels, particularly in Mexico, that do a lot more of the transiting and human smuggling, right? Human immigration smuggling. Because remember that the cartels are business organizations first and foremost. And one of the things that's sort of fascinating is that when U.S. states began to legalize pot about 10 years ago, you started to see it. It actually took a lot of the marijuana business, away from cartel-linked organizations. And so cartels actually said, listen, there's a new way we can make money, which is human trafficking. And it was very simple, right? The cartels, which controlled a lot of the routes and roads through Mexico, said, listen, why don't we begin to persuade people through both accurate information about the loopholes in the U.S. asylum system, but also through misinformation and disinformation about the opportunities in the United States. Why don't we persuade people with this information to pay our smugglers, our coyotes, tens of thousands of dollars to traffic them to the U.S. border and get them into the country. So it's essentially a kind of wraparound service where they provide transport, guarantees of safety, and coaching on how to sort of navigate the U.S. asylum system. Right, being able to make those kind of magic claims that'll get you at least a court date, which, because the asylum system is so overwhelmed, can be 5 to 7 years in the future, effectively granting you a 5-year informal work visa. Now, the cartels, what makes it so interesting is that this was originally done to offset some of the profits and proceeds lost from marijuana sales. But it turned out to have a really brilliant synergy for these cartels, because U.S. Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection, both OFO at the ports and USBP at the between ports, these organizations, they handle both humans across the border and goods and services. Well, what does that mean? Remember, if you're a major Mexican drug cartel, right, like Los Zetas or the Sinaloa cartel or Cartel del Golfo, right, all of these folks, they are moving, they smuggle in large amounts of cocaine or fentanyl or precursor chemicals or whatever the current MO is. They smuggle them through ports of entry and across the border, and that gets detected by these U.S. law enforcement agencies on the border. But what happens if you overwhelm these law enforcement agencies with surges of migrants? And so that's what will often happen, is that they'll distract these agents with huge migration surges, and then they'll use the fact that they're down to just a skeleton crew operating ports of entry, checkpoints, et cetera, to move in large amounts of illicit drugs. And so this has created a sort of dual problem for the administration. And what's fascinating to me, at least, is that the organizations being targeted by these announcements are not actually the smuggling organizations, right? They're Cartel de los Soles, which is, again, I can't speak to how large they are. I'm not really familiar with them. MS-13, I think of as being a U.S.-based drug trafficking organization first and foremost. They don't really do as much of the human trafficking. And so I'm sort of fascinated with this idea that the administration either isn't relying on the actual experts to say, listen, if you want to improve your outcomes if you want to reduce the amount of people trying to cross your border at baseline, and reduce the amount of narcotics crossing the border, here's the organizations you need to target first and foremost. And so that alone is sort of intriguing. But what's more interesting to me about this is the game that Mexico finds itself playing, right? And that's the other thing I wanted to talk about, is that Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, has had a complex relationship with Trump, and she reportedly has actually managed to work with him on a number of issues, right? In fact, according to at least one administration official, they say in public it's one thing, but things are discussed closely and coordinated behind closed doors. The relationship under Trump 2 and Sheinbaum is 100% better than the relationship with Mexican President Obrador was in office, which is interesting because, again, AMLO, or Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, was a notoriously far left. We would call him a progressive and in Mexico he was also viewed as a progressive president. And the difficulty is that Sheinbaum, I think, is much more centrist. But what's fascinating is I suspect she has sort of positioned herself as, we both defeated these radical far left candidates and our deep state's trying to take us out. And Trump's like kind of sympathetic to that. And what is interesting to me is that explicitly Sheinbaum has said it's bad. In fact, Mexico's president has described U.S. military strikes against Mexican cartels it would be an invasion and that it's totally off the table. But this article points out that Mexico may not be able to stop the U.S. if it chose to. And that's accurate, right? Up until this point, the U.S. and Mexico have had more of a collaborative relationship when it comes to taking down these drug cartels, right? With Mexican forces, particularly Mexican special forces and Mexican Marines, generally partner with the U.S. drug enforcement agencies or Homeland Security investigations, or at times, allegedly, even the U.S. military or the CIA have sort of provided them technical assistance, right? Not unlike the assistance provided to Ukraine, where it's not like the U.S. Forces are doing anything, but the U.S. military is doing some of the intelligence analysis in the back rooms, is feeding them intel, satellite photos, that sort of thing. And so that has been kind of the MO for assisting the Mexican military. But there's been a problem, right? There's a reason why the cartel violence has not really abated. In fact, in some ways, it's gotten worse. And the answer is that simply it's the drug industry and the human smuggling industry is too big to not corrupt the Mexican government, right? When you're talking about a country with a GDP per capita of, of 14,000, right? You're looking at, which is high, but only about as high as China. It's still, I think, the U.S. GDP per capita is something like 8 times that. I think we're around 60 to 80. Yeah, we're 85,000 a person, so 6 times what Mexico has. And about 4 times, and Mexico 4 times, or Canada is about 4 times that. So when you have an industry that is selling product to these ultra high income countries, and then is repatriating that wealth to Mexico, it is extremely difficult, right? Again, to resist that level of wealth influencing your government. And remember, because it's an illicit organization, they generally don't pay that much in taxes. Again, sometimes they will because they launder the money, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the problem that Mexico has is essentially that they are a middle income country trying to root out a first world profit making enterprise. And so that means that almost every organization in Mexico is under the influence of cartels, right? How much do you think that a cartel could bribe a U.S. soldier to feed them intelligence if they offered them $1 million a year? Guys, $1 million a year is a life-changing amount of money. And when you adjust that to Mexican standards, right, that's the equivalent of what these cartels often offer people. And so for Sheinbaum, I think what she has to do is thread this needle where she says, listen, actually, an organization based in the United States where cartel money simply isn't going to go as far, right? Again, if a cartel offers a U.S. soldier $60,000, are they going to take it? Maybe not, because that's about what a soldier makes in a year. And if he takes cartel money, he's going to go to jail, right? And so that's not to say it never happens, but in Mexico, you're talking about a scale and scope of influence by cartels that is off the charts. Like no trustworthy organization exists in Mexico, essentially. That's not true of the U.S. military. And so Sheinbaum might say, listen, on the surface, I have to say, you can't do this. This is bad. I oppose this. Both because her voters don't want her country's sovereignty infringed upon, but also because if the cartels think she's an ally of this operation, and it does prove to be effective, right? It isn't just like a couple performative strikes like we seem to keep doing to the Houthis, then she could literally get killed, right? The cartels will take out a politician. They are not above it. And so the fact is she has to at least performatively, and it's probably not fully performatively, say that this is bad and I won't accept this. But she's also probably not going to stop it to the extent that she can, because in some ways she's probably appreciative of saying, listen, when your drones or your soldiers strike targets in Mexico, we aren't going to be that upset about it right now, as long as they are actually cartel targets. And that's, I think, sort of the tough needle to thread that the administration and the military would have to do, is they'd have to find ways to actually be effective in their military operations. And this is a point made by one of the analysts at Brookings who talked about this, that essentially, remember, the Taliban was also a drug trafficking organization. That was one of their primary funding methods, was actually selling heroin. Literally, they ban heroin in their own country because it's bad, but they are happy to sell it. We're happy to sell it elsewhere. And so the Taliban were also a drug trafficking organization, essentially organized in the same method. And the U.S. was never able to actually curtail poppy cultivation, poppy refinement. It was never able to really make a dent in the Taliban's heroin-based fundraising operations. So you've got to ask yourself, if a country that you literally invaded and dominated completely with your military, you were unable to root out drug trafficking, you're probably not going to be able to root out it in a foreign country like Mexico, where you have to kind of be discretionary with your use of force, right? The analyst points out, he says, you can drop a big bomb and have a big bang, but the effects are limited to nil. Decapitation strikes, this is taking out the heads of cartels, only temporarily throttle the group's leadership structures, but the cartel's drug labs are so rudimentary that they can quickly be rebuilt, right? So, and that's kind of one of the problems, is that you can take off the head, but it's just like shooting the head of United CEO, right? Or the CEO of United Health. Look, it was a symbolic act. It was clearly an act of political violence, but the United Health never missed a beat, right? It wasn't like across America there were no people with United Health Insurance like couldn't get their colonoscopies, right? It barely made a dip. In fact, it barely made a dip in the stock price. So the market made clear that removing a leadership head, right? The next day, whoever the number 2 guy is knew they were in charge of the organization. They probably knew they were in charge of the organization within hours of the murder. So decapitation, not really that effective against these transnational for-profit enterprises. And as they point out, sort of going after street dealers, not effective, right? Because there's always another 19-year-old who will sling your product for a few $100. And the drug labs themselves are so rudimentary, right? These are, again, it's the couple times you've seen that stuff on like Vice News or whatever, these are very simple labs, a couple of tables, right? It's about, it's about the sourcing chemicals, sourcing laborers, sourcing the expertise. Again, it's a little bit like, it's even harder, as hard as it was to take out Iran's nuclear program, or to delay it, as people pointed out, right? You could bomb a site, but you couldn't necessarily stop the effort of a country. It's even harder to do so for these drug trafficking organizations, right? Especially because they probably have thousands of labs, and they're dispersed for each individual step. So one site will do a basic level of refinement, and then they'll move it to another site that'll do the next level of refinement. Then they'll move it to another site that'll do the next level of refinement. And then another site will do packaging. Another site will do moving. Another site will do distributing. So there's not really like it's almost like they have figured out the Russian strategy in Ukraine, right? The Russian strategy in Ukraine is never centralize your forces, never consolidate them. Always keep your infantry in tiny little groups. Disperse your logistics hubs. Disperse anything of value. Make sure nothing is close enough together that it can be taken out with a single strike. That's been the cartel's MO for years, where there's simply, it's like trying to destroy a puddle by hitting it with a hammer. The water just kind of moves out of the way and then reforms as soon as it leaves. And that's what happens when you disperse at this level. So, this isn't me like speculating, by the way. This is a known fact, because remember, in the 90s, during Operation Heavy Shadow, right? This was the capture and killing of Pablo Escobar by Delta Force and the intelligence support activity, two of the Pentagon's most elite Tier 1 units. These guys were in Colombia. They were partnered with supposedly also DevGru from the SEALs. They were attached to Colombia's search block. This was a tiny independent unit of the Colombian military that was meant to hunt down and kill Pablo Escobar. But ostensibly, they were a training and assistance mission to search block. But of course, as you can imagine, like a lot of Delta Force assistance missions, assistance often took the form of trigger pulling. And so the Delta Force, as well as, and it's not acknowledged enough, the intelligence support activity, right? These are guys who provided extremely high-level intelligence and surveillance capabilities at the time to the Colombian government. And this was a huge operation, extremely risky for the United States to be having its military operate in secret with a foreign government. And it's worth noting that even though this was seen as incredibly risky at the time, it was done in close coordination with Colombia's search block. Essentially their version of like the FBI HRT. There's not really an analogy for what search block was, but what's worth the important takeaway from this is that for all those efforts of taking out Pablo Escobar, and it actually ended up making the violence around Colombian drug trafficking way worse, right? Because instead of having a single head, remember, a profit-making enterprise, a monopoly, wants to ensure a smooth and steady flow of product, right? But when you have competition between these cartels, they are going to compete not just for price and for resources, but that competition takes the form of violence. And so the level of violence escalated, didn't de-escalate. In Colombia, not just Colombia, but also through Mexico. And so it ended up, again, the market kept finding a solution. Without Pablo Escobar, other organizations sprung up. Literally, even other drugs emerged to fill the gap that cocaine and crack had created. And so this military solution to a non-military problem is pretty has been done, right? And that's kind of the fear, is that like it'll feel good But is it the solution? Can the military solve all problems, right? Certainly we tried that in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we know now that that's simply not the case. The military is not the solver of all things, right? And this is sort of the takeaway that I want you guys to have here is that the cartels, how deeply enmeshed are they? Well, literally the same. There is a constant cat and mouse game between every major bank, essentially, and cartels, right? There are huge amounts of regulations called Know Your Customer, and that involves both knowing the identity of the people opening bank accounts, but also where they get their money, particularly cash, right? There's a reason why, if you show up with $10,000 in cash, your bank's going to make you fill out a form, and you're just going to say, listen, grandma passed away, and I opened up her safe, and there was a bunch of cash she had been putting away for a rainy day. And your bank goes, okay. But remember, if you show up every 2 days with $10,000 in cash, your bank is going to have a lot more questions about where you're getting this cash. And so some banks, though, don't really follow those regulations. Some of them know not to ask that many questions, right? And these banks are constantly getting massive fines. And the key is you got to learn how to speak government, right? So here's an example. TD Bank was fined $3 billion. That was the fine, by the way, in penalties for violating the Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering laws, right? Now, they use the words banks inadequate controls. And what's key is when you hear a bank say, they say the bank had inadequate controls, what that means is that they went into their internal rules about who they have to know and how they have to supervise how transactions are happening. And they opened up a little side corridor where they said, listen, in these couple of branches, if you deposit it in this kind of way, we won't ask questions. Our policies have this little gap in them. And if you're a drug cartel, you move as much money as you can through that gap in the bank's regulations. And so because the bank literally doesn't collect the data, the bank is looking the other way. It's like a security guard who opens the back door of the club and he goes, listen, I didn't see you guys walk in here. And he looks away, right? The bank goes, I don't know how much money's moving through and I have no idea if it's legit. So definitely you guys can't prove it because I don't know what's happening. I don't know where this money's coming from, right? And so that's why these laws exist, because banks too often were just opening the side door, looking away, and then going, I don't know who got into the bank. And so that's why they get hit with fines, not for necessarily enabling drug trafficking or working with cartels or whatever, but simply saying, guys, you have no idea where this money came from. And they laundered allegedly $600 million through its system that's known. But as we just discussed, it's not about what's known, it's about what's unknown. The bank pled guilty to the charges, including conspiracy to commit money laundering, and was subject to restrictions on its U.S. asset, requiring a 10% reduction in size. But that's just one bank. Remember, 2024, last year, another bank, Nordea Bank, money laundering $35 million related to Panama Papers scandal. Bank failed to prevent illegal activities by inadequately screening clients. Again, they don't know who's serving there. Citibank of New York, $65 million. Deutsche Bank, $186 million, right? There's so many of these, and that's literally just like the last really 18 months. So the other issue is that the cartels are also moving money the way, well, you and I would illicitly move money, frankly, using cryptocurrencies. And this is where things get pretty uncomfortable, right? Is that, yeah, President Trump designates these guys as Mexican drug cartels as terror organizations, but there's a huge problem. And these terror organizations, they love using cryptocurrencies. They're anonymous. They are extremely rapid. Because remember, one of the things that Mexican cartels often do is they sell all of their drugs for cash in the United States, but then to get that cash back to Mexico, right, to pay their bribes and to, they have to physically palletize that cash. And remember, you and I are like, dude, it'd be easy to smuggle cash in, but have you ever actually held $10,000 in your hand? It's actually pretty bulky. Now, have you ever held $100,000 in your hand? Probably not. But it's really difficult. It's like a suitcase. But what about $1 million? Well, that would be actually hard. It'd be a struggle to even get through a carry-on. So when you're talking about cartels that are doing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in sales a month, you're talking about pallets and pallets of cash they have to get across the border. But with cryptocurrencies, that's not a problem, right? Especially now, because, well, there's so much legitimate-ish transaction in cryptocurrencies, or so many other there's legitimate, gray market, and illicit transactions all happening at the same time with cryptocurrencies, all indistinguishable, all around anonymous accounts, right? You don't know who's on the other end of that wallet. And so the Sinaloa cartel has been trying to figure out for a while how to launder their proceeds through this. But again, they collaborate with Chinese money laundering networks, but almost certainly they're also working with what's the word I want? Oh my gosh, the like USD coin or Tether or currencies that are pegged to cryptocurrencies pegged to the US dollar. But again, we're seeing the same thing. And if you're like, man, Paul, this sounds exactly like Russian efforts to bypass US sanctions, right? Using Chinese banks and Chinese suppliers, right? And in fact, in 2024, the Sinaloa cartel, right, was indicted for a $50 million drug proceed laundering effort using Chinese banking, underground bank efforts, right, which included, again, using cryptocurrency purchases to conceal the origin of funds. And, right, you can see a bunch of these allegations and hits where Sinaloa cartel-linked individuals are using cryptocurrency to move their proceeds through. And these are just the ones getting busted. You can imagine the DOJ is not exactly awash in cryptocurrency experts. But this is a huge problem for the administration because not only is the Trump administration super pro-crypto, but in fact, the... gosh, what are they called? I'm just going to keep calling them Tether or USDC. The USD. Okay, look at this. All right. So there are links between stablecoin. That's it. Okay. So the US passed stablecoin legislation, right, in the Genius Act that said, listen, it's okay. You're allowed to have stablecoin like the USDC. And the legislation says it's good to go. It's fine to have USDC, right? But here's where things are uncomfortable. The Treasury Secretary, Howard Lutnick, well, he's not Secretary of Treasury, he's Secretary of Commerce. Howard Lutnick, his firm, Cantor Fitzgerald, of which he is still the CEO, is the owner of, I think, USDC, or one of the major exchanges that sort of backs USDC. Right? He's become a prominent cheerleader for Tether. And Tether, as you guys know, is one of the shadiest stablecoins, right? Nobody knows how much is backing it. Nobody knows if it's even really backed. It's just sort of been accepted by the market as one Tether is $1. We don't have to worry if it's really backed or not. And so it's pretty troubling to sit there, and you can see why the administration is on one hand, right? It's like one arm of the administration is watering the grass and the other arm is mowing it. That's where things kind of get absurd, where you have these things where, okay, we're deregulating banks, we are hyping up crypto, we're encouraging stable coins, we're literally allowing the owner of one of the major stable coins to be the Secretary of Commerce, right? Which is known and identified as being used in these kind of criminal transactions. And then you're having the U.S. military mow the grass, all right, and take out the cartels or grind down the cartels with the most inefficient method possible. And so overall, this is a tremendous problem for the U.S. government and for the taxpayer, right? Again, if Doge was really looking for fraud, he would look for programs like this, where the U.S. government rows in two different directions, spins the boat, and goes nowhere. Because it's not about the government, does actually a pretty good job of tracking its spending. It does a terrible job of understanding if that spending is achieving a singular objective, right? Is it actually doing what we mean to do? And is it doing the most important things? Because as we always talk about, right, in Afghanistan, there was 50 different organizations that had 50 different main efforts of the war. And ultimately, there was no single person who was pulling every organization together and saying, listen, we need to focus on doing 3 things. And that means that accepting that the 15 other things, we don't do them at all. We don't waste taxpayer money, right? So anyway, that's all I got. Hit that subscribe. One more thing, guys. If you haven't subscribed and become a member at combatvetnews.com, it's the best way to support the channel and to keep me fully independent. Plus, you get access to 3 additional videos a week, all of which are uncensored combat footage analysis that YouTube would never let me show you. Plus, a huge thank you to the existing Colonel tier members of Combat Vet News and, of course, the Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do it without you guys. I'll see y'all in the next video.